up, guys? Welcome back to part 3 of the Scotch Gambit. Just recapping what we looked at before, playing e4, e5, bringing our knight out, attacking this pawn, and they're going to bring their knight out as well. We hit them with this move d4, and most people take this pawn. We can now play bishop c4, getting another attacker into the game. And in part 1, we looked at bishop to b4, and in part 2, we looked at bishop to c5. Today, we're going to look at bishop to e7. This is a pretty passive move by black, as they're not hitting us with a check like they would be on bishop b4, and they're not defending this pawn in the center. Maybe black doesn't want to bring the bishop out to c5 because it would be undefended and potentially a target, but either way, it's going to allow us to take back in the center for free. So when we see the Benima defense, we're just going to play knight to d4, and this will be our starting position. Just know that you could also play c3 here, and if black takes this pawn, white already has a winning position after queen d5. But we're not going to use this variation because black has this great in-between move, knight to a5. Our bishop has to get off of this diagonal, and now black can take the pawn, and white is just a pawn down. So if we go back, whenever we see bishop e7, the Benima defense, we're just going to take this pawn on d4 and play from here. The first thing that we're going to look at is an immediate knight trade. So at any time, if black wants to, he can take our knight in the center of the board, and we can take back with our queen. If black does this immediately, our queen develops to the center of the board, and now it's attacking this g7 pawn. There's 3 main ways black can play from here: defending the g7 pawn by bringing the knight out, defending the g7 pawn by bringing the bishop out, or playing d5 and getting an in-between move on the bishop. Let's look at the knight first. If the knight or the bishop go to f6, we're going to push our pawn to e5 and kick it immediately. Now, I refer to this position as the quick fried knight because there's nowhere that the knight can move to and survive. If the knight goes back to g8, we can just play this very thematic move, queen d5, that we saw in the last 2 parts. And the only way that black can defend this position is by playing this move that we've seen, knight to h6. We can take this knight off the board, and then after black castles, we can move our bishop away, and we'll end the game piece up. If black tries to escape to h5, we can just play g4, and black's knight is trapped on the side of the board. So if we go back, after we play e5, black is now on a tightrope, and he can only play one move here to survive. It's pawn to d5. We see that black is attacking our bishop, but we realize we can just take this knight, and black has no time to recapture this pawn with a tempo on our queen because we can just check the king and get our bishop to safety, and we win the game. If we go back, black must take our bishop, and now we can trade queens. Black must take with the bishop. Black cannot take with the king or he'll lose his bishop, so black takes with the bishop, and now we can take this pawn on g7. Once again, still in the tightrope, he can only move to 1 square. We can now defend this pawn with bishop to h6, and we're actually going to give this pawn away if black wants it. So the next couple moves can go like this. Black starts to make a pathway for his king to get to the pawn, and we're just developing. As black makes his way over, we get castled. Black can attack our pawn and our bishop. As we go back and black takes, we now have even material, but we have a much better position than our opponent. Okay, I'm editing this video right now, and I wanted to add in the very dangerous looking bishop to f6, attacking our g7 pawn and also attacking our pawn on b2. So we're going to protect our b pawn by playing knight to c3, and if black takes our pawn on g7, we can just take back with our bishop. Once black takes our bishop, we're going to play knight to d5, threatening to fork the king and the rook. If black wants to hold on to his pawn, he has to move the king over, and now he can set up discovered checks by castling queenside. For instance, if black takes this pawn on g2, he'll lose the game instantly. So let's go back here. What if black just takes our knight outright? This is going to double our pawns, but the important thing is that if we castle queenside, just like before, black will never be able to get to our bishop, meaning he'll never be able to get to this pawn. And we can use the tactics surrounding getting this pawn to a queen to win the game. So let's go back. Now let's look at when the bishop comes to f6. If the bishop comes to f6, we can play the same move, e5. And our idea with this move is trying to funnel black into the g5 square. If he goes back to e7, we immediately win the game with d5. If he goes to h4, we play g3. And now he can't go back to e7 again because we play queen d5. Obviously, he can't go back to f6, so he'll go bishop g5. If black does this straight away, we can take this bishop and black has no choice but to take back with the queen. We could castle kingside here if we want, but an even better play is to go knight c3 and allow this g-pawn to be taken. We castle queenside here, and now we're going to use that open file to our advantage. We're going to play f4 in the future, get some tempos on the queen, and attack this f7 and g7 pawn. If we go back, let's look at one more variation. Black can also go to h4, and when we push this pawn and black comes back to g5, we're going to use the same strategy here where we play knight to c3. The main difference here being that our g-pawn is very conveniently defended when we played g3. Now let's go back and look at one more variation, and that's queen to e7, pinning our e-pawn to the king. And now it's very important here to play f4 and not bishop f4. We do this because we know the move d6 is coming, and we don't want black to take on d6 with a fork on our queen and bishop. So we play f4, and now when we see this d6 move, we can castle kingside, and if black likes, he can open up the file for our rook with an attack on this f6 bishop. This bishop cannot take this e-pawn because of tactics on f7, so the queen has to take here. We can still play this really classy move, bishop takes f7, and black can't retake, or we'll get this queen for free because the bishop is pinned. So the king has to come to the center of the board, we swap off the queens, and we bring our bishop back. The material is even, but black's king is completely exposed in the middle of the board. So let's go back. So now let's look at this third and last variation, pawn to d5. Now white is really controlling the d5 square, so we can just immediately take this pawn off the board. The most likely move you'll see here is actually bishop to f6, because knight to f6 won't come with a tempo on the queen. So we see bishop to f6, and we just calmly move the queen out of the way. Black will most likely develop the knight, and we can safely castle away. Just know if this light square bishop ever comes out, we can start attacking that b-pawn, and black has no time to push it because we have tactics with the battering ram on the f7 pawn. So black will most likely stop that pawn with queen to d6, and now we can jump in. Let's look at one more d5 line. After we take this pawn, black can just play knight to f6, and now we can bring our knight out to c3, defending the d5 pawn in extra time. Black got his kingside pieces out, he's most likely going to castle now, and we play the bishop move, bishop to f4. We don't want to put the bishop on g5 right now because this loses to the tactic knight takes on d5. Black gets our pawn, and if we try to take it, this bishop falls. If we try to take the bishop, the knight can go back. So if we go back, so we bring the bishop to f4, and white can castle either kingside or queenside from here. Common theme is playing c5 to kick the queen. However, this does create a passed pawn with e5, and we can take advantage of that by bringing our queen into the center of the board. If this knight moves anywhere to attack this queen, we can just pocket our queen in the c7 square and force a queen trade. After this trade, this d-pawn is going to be coming down with a vengeance. If black goes to d7, we use the same tactic. We just pocket the queen on c7, and after this trade, we're looking to push d6. Now let's go back. So just to recap, we just looked at this immediate knight trade. We took with our queen, and we looked at three variations from here, whether the bishop comes to f6, the knight comes to f6, or black plays d5. So now let's look at what we're going to do if black doesn't trade knights immediately. Let's just look at this move, knight to e5. Because black played the Benima defense and put his bishop on e7, that allowed us to take black's pawn in the center of the board. However, when our knight moved from f3 to d4, it stopped defending this e5 square, making it possible for black to jump into this square and attack our bishop. So black plays knight to e5, and now let's look at the position of this bishop. If the bishop goes to b5, it can just get kicked back to b3 anyway. So it really is between going to b3 and going to e2. Now let's look at bishop to e2. This is a very passive move because our bishop is never going to control black's side of the board in any meaningful way. And though it cuts off squares for the knight to advance, it's never really going to do anything more than this. So for that reason, we like to go back to b3. It'll stay on this long offensive diagonal. And in the future, we can think about ideas like bringing the queen to d5, attacking both the undefended knight and threatening checkmate. We also have ideas of playing f4, kicking this knight and allowing us to completely take the center with e5. Let's look at some example lines. Black is most likely going to bring the knight out or push the d6 pawn to bring his light squared bishop out. If he brings the knight out, we can just bring our knight out as well. And when he plays d6, we don't even have to take time to castle. We can just immediately play f4. If black retreats, great. We can now castle and we have great control of the center. But black can also throw in this in-between move, bishop to g4, attacking our queen. We don't panic, we just look at the available squares for our queen. If we want to, we can also think about bringing the knight back. We just push the queen forward, and black is out of sneaky moves. The knight has to go back. Now we can kick the bishop away, the bishop has to go back, and now we can turn black's counter offense into our attack with g4 and play from here. I just want to add one more knight e5 line with the idea of pushing c5. Just know that we don't have to worry about this pawn somehow trapping our bishop. Our bishop has to run to a4, and now it's getting attacked with queen a5, because this pawn is never in time to take our bishop. Black's best try is queen a5, checking us and attacking this knight. We already got a piece, so we can ignore it, and now black can take whichever piece he likes. If he takes this knight, we just take this pawn, and white's up a pawn with a good position. If black takes the bishop, now we can play queen d5, and not only do we get our knight into the center of the board, threatening to fork the king and the rook, we will either be taking away castling rights from black or misplacing their bishop. Now we can take this pawn back, and white is in a very good position. So now we can go back to the main position. So just to recap, black plays the Benima Defense, and we take this pawn in the center of the board. We looked at an immediate knight trade, and we also looked at when the knight comes to e5 and attacks our bishop. We looked at the nature of this bishop and how we can keep it offensive if we keep it on b3. So let's say black doesn't move this knight and instead plays one of the most common continuations, d6. We're going to respond to this move by castling, and now let's look at how this light square bishop can come out. If it goes to any of these squares, it'll be taken immediately, and if it goes to e6, it loses a pawn. But there are a couple ways to unlock squares for the bishop, one of them being knight to f6. If black plays knight to f6, attacking our e4 pawn, we're going to respond to c3. However, black now also covers the g4 square, now making it possible for his bishop to come in. Whenever we see this move bishop g4, we just swat it away with f3, and now the most popular move by far here is actually a blunder. Because the bishop has left this diagonal, he's not in a position to retreat to defend the knight on c6. So we can pin this knight. Black has two main options from here. He can either castle away or defend with the queen. If he castles away, we can take this knight with the bishop first, so that when black takes back with the pawn, we can take with the knight, getting a tempo on the queen, as well as picking up this bishop on our next move with check on the king. The queen's gonna move, we take the bishop, black takes back, and now we're a pawn up and we have a comfortable position. And now let's look at what we do against queen d7. We're just gonna jump in with knight d5, and this is just going to be tactic city. Black cannot take our knight because this knight will fall as well, and black has no time to castle away because now we can actually take this knight. If black tries to take back, forking our pieces, we have the truly awesome move bishop takes c6, and black can't take this bishop because of the fork on e7. So now let's look at what else black can do to unlock squares for his bishop to come out. You may be wondering, is the only thing that's preventing this bishop from coming to e6 this knight assisting this bishop? Meaning, can't black just trade these knights off and put his bishop on e6? Well, this wouldn't work because we could trade off and then take this pawn on g7. And if black wanted to first defend that pawn with knight to f6, we can play knight to c3, and now the question is black able to get this bishop to e6? If he makes this move, we can just trade these bishops off immediately and play e5. Black has to take the pawn here, and he can't retreat. If black runs to d7, we can just take this pawn on d6, and when black takes back, we can once again pick up the pawn on g7. Note that black also obviously can't go to h5, because we can just take this d pawn, and when black takes back, we can play queen to g4, attacking the g pawn, attacking the e pawn, attacking the knight. This is going to be an easy win for white. So black must take this pawn, and now we can take back with the queen. Now we're not only threatening to take this e6 pawn, but we're also threatening to play bishop to b5, checking the king, and attacking this pawn on b7. Black can sacrifice the pawn for king safety by castling kingside, or if he wants to hang on to the pawn, he can play queen to d6. If we try to use this move now, black blocks with queen to c6, and after this trade, black's able to castle on his next move, but his pawn structure is completely ruined. This is a game that we should be able to win. So now let's look at the final line of chapter 1, and that's after this knight trade. We just looked at bishop to e6. Black's bishop probably isn't coming to f5 or a3, but what about bishop g4? We're not going to play f3 here because we don't want to open up this diagonal on our king if we don't have to. So we're going to play h3. Now, black can't retreat with bishop to h5 because once we push f4, black's light square bishop is essentially trapped. Black may think he's escaping with h6, but after playing f5, black's light square bishop is going to get trapped by these pawns. So black can't go to h5, can't go to f5. We looked at bishop to e6 earlier, and now black returns to d7, and we continue on the main line. So thank you guys so much for watching. That's the end of chapter 1. Just to recap a little bit of what we saw. In part 1 of chapter 1, we looked at bishop to b4. We pushed this pawn, we traded these pawns, and we mostly looked at the bishop going back here where we castled and got our queen to b3. In part 2, black played bishop to c5, defending his pawn. We responded to this by castling, and then we looked at lines from the Scotch Gambit. Now in part 3, black decides not to defend his pawn and just play bishop to e7. We took this pawn on d4 and we looked at an immediate knight trade. We also looked at the idea of the knight going to e5 where we bring the bishop back. We also saw normal development like d6, knight f6. When we defend the pawn, we looked at castling and where this bishop can go. And after black castles, we're going to bring our bishop to f4. And this is going to be the main position that we look at in chapter 2. In chapter 2, we're going to go farther down these lines, as well as looking at when black plays an immediate knight f6, which is the most popular line in the Scotch Gambit. So stay tuned for the next videos.